The Mind's Eye Show with Brian Turnoff is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and all major platforms. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. You are now standing at the intersection of history and mystery, science and the strange, and crime and the sublime. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, your host through this audio-torium of audacity. We're starting our trek into the summer sunset, my little buckaroos and buckaras. 2 episodes left before we take our annual short summer break, but we are going to go out in a bang, starting with the battle at OK Corral. 30 bullets in 30 seconds, 3 men killed, 3 men down. On one side, you got the law-breaking cowboys. On the other side, we got the law-enforcing marshals. Left standing are Wyatt Earp and the shotgun-toting Doc Holliday. But it's almost everything else about this bloody clash that may not be exactly what it seems. Tonight, you're going to get the true story of the most famous shootout in American frontier history. New York Times best-selling author Tom Clavin peers behind the legend of Tombstone to give you the most accurate account of the events leading up to the gunfight at OK Corral. Then we'll also discuss the aftermath, including Wyatt Earp's mythical Vendetta Ride when he went vigilante on the cowboys who gunned down his brothers. When the Mind's Eye returns, Tom Clavin tells us about Tombstone, the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from hell. Stay tuned. Appreciate you sticking around for the Mind's Eye. Whoever's quickest on the draw lives. That's the theme of tonight's episode. Seems that not much has changed since the Wild West, just the weapons have gotten a bit bigger and much more destructive. Now we know who's going to be quickest on the draw today when it comes to destructive energy weapons. The U.S. Navy recently displayed a test of a powerful laser weapon system in which the blast was so intense that the targeted drone caught fire almost immediately. The video is pretty astounding, maybe even a little frightening. We posted the link on our social media sites. Take a look now, Facebook and Twitter at Mind's Eye Show, or just go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. Watching the video, I couldn't help but think of the ending of one of my all-time favorite 80s movies, Real Genius, starring Val Kilmer. Wait for it. Val Kilmer also played Doc Holliday in the movie Tombstone. Forget everything you know about the event, especially from that movie. We're talking with New York Times bestselling author Tom Clavin about the story behind the legendary gunfight at OK Corral. See what I did there? Back in a Mind's Eye moment. New York Times bestseller Tom Clavin joins the Mind's Eye for a hog-killing time. Tom, howdy. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad you have me on the show.
Can't wait to talk about this one. Love the book. And we're discussing the book, Tombstone, the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from hell. Hell of a name, which is the third book in Tom's Frontier Lawman trilogy. Tell us about the premise of the book and how it connects to the previous two.
Well, Tombstone came about because there were 2 previous books. It was kind of an organic ending to the trilogy in that I had actually written Dodge City, the second book in the trilogy, as a standalone book. You know, it was going to be it was the story of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson as young lawmen together in Dodge City, a specific place and time, the mid to late 1870s, Dodge City, Kansas. And then, I turned the book in and got it ready for publication and was on to another book of a very different topic. And I was in the middle of the book tour for Dodge City, which came out in February of 2017, when my editor called me. I was in Wichita, I remember, and said, the book's, making its debut on the New York Times bestseller list. So where it remained for a while, and it was very successful. So when I got back to New York, my editor said, can we go back to the Wild West, think of another iconic character who maybe hasn't had something done definitively about him or her before or not for many, many years. And that's how the book Wild Bill came about. Now, chronologically, that sort of begins from after the Civil War and takes us into the 1870s. And then when that book came out, and that book was also successful, then it just seemed to make sense. Well, okay, there's actually an arc that begins with Wild Bill at the ending of the Civil War and sort of ends in Tombstone in the Earp Vendetta Ride in 1882. So let's go to Tombstone and let's connect the events there to the previous two books. And also with Tombstone, that arc includes Tombstone being kind of like the last gasp of the Wild West, the gunfight that took place there. So this did not begin as a trilogy by any means. I think if I had started Dodge City thinking, my God, I'm going to spend the next 4 years writing 3 books, I would have said, well, maybe I shouldn't go this direction. But it just sort of organically happened.
And before you touched on something and how about the gunfight at the OK Corral had such a big impact on American history and I guess in our perspective. So talk about the role that the gunfight at the OK Corral it's kind of served in our history telling.
There was sort of like an impact at the time, and there's an impact that still echoes to this day. The impact at the time was that it was really the last major confrontation of the Wild West and the New West. What I mean by that is very, very reluctantly, the 3 Earp Brothers and Doc Holliday were representing law and order and people who wanted Tombstone to be a sophisticated sort of San Francisco of the Southwest and be, working their way towards being a 20th century city. And on the other side, you had the ranchers and the cowboys who wanted the Wild West to stay wild for as long as they could keep it wild. They didn't want much law and order. They wanted to be able to steal cattle and steal horses and shoot up the town on a drunken Saturday night. And so Tombstone was became a flashpoint. That gunfight was a flashpoint between these two opposing, conflicting forces. And I think what resonates to this day is that we look back at that gunfight as almost like a mythical event. You think about some Civil War battles have become part of our vocabulary. You say Gettysburg, immediately what you're talking about. Yeah. That's true of even World War II thing. Iwo Jima, immediately what people are talking about. You say the gunfight at the OK Corral, everybody knows what you're talking about. That doesn't mean they know the true story, but they know exactly what you're talking about. Oh yeah, Wyatt Earp was involved with that. Doc Holliday. Oh yeah, Tombstone, Arizona. So a big reason for doing the book too was to tell that true story and put it in the context of, this was not only just a gun battle. It it didn't operate in a vacuum. It was that clash between the Old West and the New West.
I think, another impact that you touched on in the book, and this is a great quote from it, and it's kind of funny who said it, though. Some few of us pioneers are entitled to credit for what we have done. We have been the forerunners of government. If it hadn't been for me and a few like me, there never would have been any government in some of these towns like Tombstone. Of all people, Doc Holliday was the one who said it.
Yeah, who would give him? Yeah. But he's normally portrayed as a drunk, which he was many times. But this is quite eloquent of what he said, and it's actually it's something he wrote. So it's not like somebody overheard him and it probably got changed over the years. You can see it in actually Doc Holliday's handwriting that he wrote this, and he makes such a very, very good point because. The frontier, whether it was Kansas, Dodge City, Wichita, Abilene, moving its way west until it became parts of Texas and then parts of New Mexico and then Tombstone in Arizona. As the frontier kept moving west, people, were outdistancing law and order, a justice system, a law enforcement peace officer system. So Tombstone's a perfect example of that because the law enforcement system in Tombstone was lacking, was very fragile, to put even a nice spin on it. And so it ended up being, Virgil Morgan and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday in that, vacant lot on October 26, 1881, who were representing the forces of law and order. Yes, Virgil was officially the marshal of Tombstone. He had gotten the job basically because the previous marshal had fled in fear at the idea of facing down the cowboys. And then you had Wyatt and Morgan, who were deputized to assist Virgil in this confrontation, and Doc Holliday, who Virgil really had to hold his nose to deputize Doc Holliday, and so Doc's quote was really accurate. In a lot of these frontier towns, it could be individuals, some of whom did not wear badges, who had to make a decision. Are we going to be a town that's in anarchy and violence, or am I going to help this town achieve some peace and law and order and a safe place for people to raise their families.
And you bring so many of the people from the background and from Tombstone into the story, and you really make it come alive from so many different angles. I mean, my God, the names listed in this book are some of the best names I've ever heard. Curly Bill, Buckskin, Pony Deal, I think is my favorite. Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, Texas Jack. I think if I had to have my own Wild West nickname, I think I kind of like Big Boy Brian. What's your? Have you ever thought of your own frontier name?
Two Gun Tom Clavin.
Two Gun Tom. I like it. That works. I thought I was going to go with Tombstone Tom, but I like that one a little bit more.
I'm glad you brought that up though, because people might think, oh, he's making these names up, and that's the beauty of it. When you find out that. When you base a book on facts and not just on the legends or on hearsay or on the embellishments or the fictions, you could read this book and say, oh, there really was a guy named Turkey Creek Jack Johnson. There really was a guy named Curly Bill Brocius. There was a Johnny Ringo. That wasn't just a character, a John Wayne character in a movie. And that makes it extra fun because people can read it and hopefully find it a good story, but also have the reassurance that I'm not reading BS. These people actually existed. These events actually happened.
Let's go a little bit more into the events that actually led up to OK Corral. I mean, you discuss in the book how there's these number of links in the chain that spilled over into this gunfight at the OK Corral. Above all, which event or which people, I guess, do you think most contributed to the clash actually happening?
Well, I think Johnny Behan, the sheriff, Johnny Behan was the sheriff of Pima County, which is where Tombstone was located. And for a time, Wyatt was his deputy. What happened was that, and Johnny Behan was not somebody who he liked having the job and the paycheck, and you got to keep some of the tax revenue. I mean, he even hired Curly Bill Brocius, who was a sociopathic cowboy, to help enforce his tax collections. But when Cochise County was formed and Tombstone sort of broke off to become part of Cochise County, the deal was that Wyatt would become the sheriff of the new county. And Behan basically betrayed him. So that was one element of it. That Wyatt got shafted by Johnny Behan. The second element was that Johnny Behan was not an effective sheriff, and he was intimidated by the cowboys, and he wanted to have nothing to do with facing them down and keeping Tombstone a safe place. The other element of it was that Wyatt didn't do this as revenge, but it just so happened he fell in love with Johnny Behan's girlfriend. And so you had that personal aspect. There's almost soap opera aspect to it, where Johnny Behan and Josephine Marcus was supposed to get married, but then once she set her peepers on Wyatt Earp and he got a gander at her, well, they fell in love, and she would eventually become the fourth Mrs. Wyatt Earp, which is a whole other story right there. But so you had that kind of jealousy angle connected to it. And so when tensions got worse between the corrupt cowboys and the ranchers who were dealing with stolen cattle, and the Earps, who people came to recognize in the absence of an effective sheriff, okay, the Earps will protect us. Wyatt Earp came to Tombstone with a great reputation from Dodge City. They'll protect us. These are the guys we can count on. They didn't want any part of this, but that's the reputation they got. The clash became inevitable, and when you read the book, I think people will agree that things were not in Tombstone in the fall of 1881 after a long hot summer with a lot of tensions. There really was no way this thing was just going to dissipate. It was almost like violence had to happen for Tombstone to take the next step forward.
Yeah, it was just one big tinderbox, and I think one of the reasons why people believe that the Earps were the lawmen and they were there to protect, even though they clearly didn't really want to be in there. That role was forced upon them. I mean, really, it was a big part of it was the media. I mean, the Tombstone epitaph. I mean, that had a really big influence, right?
It did. I'm glad you brought that up. Tombstone actually had two newspapers, the Epitaph and the Nugget. Each one represented a different faction. The Epitaph was very much in the supporters of the Earp Brothers. The editor, John Clum, was a friend of the Earp Brothers. He supported them. But ironically, he helped make the gunfight at the OK Corral inevitable because he was always proclaiming to his readership how good the Earps were, and you can count on them. And if push comes to shove, my money's on Virgil Wyatt, and Morgan Earp. And so that had public opinion looking at the Earps that way. The other newspaper, the Nugget, was more supportive of the cowboys and the ranchers and the Wild West element. And all they kept doing was saying, Earps are bad, they're going to cause trouble, watch out they don't go after these cowboys and kill them in cold blood. So that's a good point that you made, that you had these two newspapers who, I don't know if they intended it or not, it was just a product of their reporting, but they were egging on the two factions to eventually confront each other.
Yeah, with the newspapers, I mean, some things never change, right? Some things never stay the same, but some things never change.
Right.
and before, you talked about how there's a lot of misconceptions and exaggerations about the OK Corral. I mean, one that I didn't even kind of realize, and it's almost comical, that the gunfight didn't even take place within or next to the OK Corral.
Right.
So talk about that, and then also go on into maybe some other, what's the biggest exaggeration or misconception about OK Corral that we believe today?
Well, I think, so the one you just mentioned, that the gun battle did not take place in the OK Corral. It took place in a vacant lot that was only 15 feet wide. I think another perception we have of the OK Corral fight from movies like My Darling Clementine and a movie like The Gunfight at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas is that this gun battle was this running gun battle. People were hiding behind buildings and water barrels and shooting out outside of windows and taking cover behind horses and water troughs. And the gun battle was 30 seconds and 30 shots fired. That's a really intense, and just in an alley just 15 feet wide, that's a really intense fight. And it was over literally in 30 seconds, and 3 men were dead, 3 were wounded. And I think another misperception about the gun battle, and certainly a reason why I wanted to do the book, and it's because, and you can see it in the subtitle, is especially in movies, the gunfight is over, cue the credits, swell the music, and the movie's over. And the gun battle at the OK Corral shootout was not the end of the story by any means. There were 2 really important chapters that followed that. One was that Wyatt and Doc Holliday were put on trial for murder, and a month-long trial as a legal thriller, basically a courtroom drama that took place. And if they had been convicted, only thing we might know about Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp is that they spent the rest of their lives in prison or were hung as murderers. And the other aspect of it is the Vendetta Ride. That's, to me, it's the Vendetta Ride that made Wyatt Earp the legend that he is. When he realized, or he came to the conclusion, I've just had 2 brothers shot, and Morgan died from his wounds, and I can't trust Johnny Behan or anybody else in the legal system that's going to get justice. Doc, you and I have to saddle up and get that justice ourselves. And off they went with a few other guys to help them to track down the guys who bushwhacked his brothers.
I want to break down a lot of what you just said because there's a lot to kind of extrapolate from there. So let's talk a little bit about the players involved a little bit more. So many, Wyatt Earp, so many words have been used to describe him: vigilante, hero, thief. I mean, what word would you use to describe him after all the research that you've done about him?
Wyatt Earp was a man who had a code of honor. That doesn't mean he was a good guy. I mean, he had spent time in prison for being a horse thief earlier in his life. And he wasn't somebody who could be loyal to women. He had 4 wives, and sometimes they overlapped. So he was definitely a chauvinist. But he did have a code of honor. He loved his brothers very much, and he would do anything for his brothers. And he also tried to be fair to people. He did not try to precipitate fights. He only very reluctantly would take a gun out. And a lot of times when he took his gun out in a confrontation, it was to knock somebody over the head with it, not shoot them. He tried to do the right thing. He tried to keep his emotions in check and not fly off the handle. That, to me, is what makes the Vendetta Ride so dramatic, because when Wyatt set off on that ride, he crossed a line, a personal line, where he went from lawman and trying to be a good citizen and trying to be a businessman in the community, respectable businessman in the community, to vigilante. Now, I think people reading the book will understand that he got pushed too far when you see one of your brothers.
Mm-hmm.
The two brothers he was closest to. I mean, his older brother Virgil got ambushed and wasn't killed, but was maimed for life. And then his brother Morgan got shot in the back and killed. Especially in 1880s Arizona, you're going to saddle up and you're going to go get those people, and you can't, he wasn't going to sit back and say, well, I'm hoping that the sheriff will go get them. The sheriff wasn't going anywhere. And so that's what made that so remarkable to me about Wyatt, that he allowed himself to cross that line. Of course, with the full support of Doc Holliday, who crossed plenty of lines in his time.
It also seemed that grief always kind of played a role in him crossing that line. After you talked about him going to horse thief, that was after his first wife and child died, and then and then his Vendetta Ride. And clearly, that's not justified by the law. But he was obviously in grief. It was also, his brother was killed on his 34th birthday. Would you agree with grief had a huge role in these particular moments where he did cross that line?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it is discussed in the book, and what Wyatt's early life was like, which included that when he was living in Lamar, Missouri, and he was only, I think, 20, 21, 22 years old, well before he was going to have anything to do with being a lawman, he fell in love with a woman there, and they did get married, and she was pregnant. And actually, his first job was the lawman job was he got to be constable of Lamar, Missouri. And as far as he was concerned, he was going to spend the rest of his life there and have a family and support them and be a solid citizen. And then his wife was something like 8 months pregnant, and it's believed that she contracted cholera, which is not uncommon in those days. And both she and the baby died. And when Wyatt went into this tailspin, somebody who other people thought was not that emotional, he was overcome by grief, went into a tailspin, and got into trouble.
Yeah, it seemed like that kind of always crossed the line. He would always he came back quickly, it seemed like most times. But, but that's something I kind of observed and seemed to kind of come through and bleed through the book, at least. No pun intended, of course.
Yes.
Do you think Wyatt and the other Earps' sense of right and wrong and lawing kind of came from their upbringing or particularly their father's influence or maybe lack thereof?
It's almost in spite of their father.
Right, exactly.
His father was kind of a con man. He did serve time as a justice of the peace and as a constable himself, and had a storekeeper. He was constantly resting. He was constantly moving his family around the United States. His father would cut corners, and I think that his father was an angry man. He always felt kind of ill-served by life. And so he goes off to war to find glory in the war, the Mexican-American War. He gets kicked by a mule and has to be thrown out of the army, sent back in kind of disgrace back home because he got kicked by a mule. So I think Virgil and Wyatt and Morgan, they all had an ethical code of honor, but I think it was because they felt like, we don't want to turn out like Dad. He was not a horrible man. He's not a monster by any means.
No.
He did have anger management issues, but I think they wanted to find their own way and be upstanding citizens. That's what they were always questing for. That's why they came to Tombstone. It wasn't to be lawmen. It was because they wanted to take advantage of the boomtown that Tombstone was.
And another thing that Earp was, in quest for was something that I didn't realize was social prominence. That was really important to him.
Yeah, it was, because, again, his father had some respectable jobs along the way, but a lot of times they were an itinerant family, barely getting by. And for the Earps to find some kind of social respectability through being, successful businessmen was very important. Wyatt spent the rest of his life searching for that. He was always trying to find a business, a pursuit that was going to make him a decent amount of money, and he was have a more respectable stature in whatever community he was in. He never quite got there, but he never stopped trying.
Yeah, the Earps, particularly Wyatt, I guess, it seemed like they wanted it to be politically savvy, or Wyatt did, but that they really weren't. If anything, they were political tools.
They were. I mean, I mentioned before about Johnny Behan sort of shafting Wyatt with that sheriff job. You know, a more savvy political animal would have seen that coming a mile away. But Wyatt was like, oh, okay, so we're going to shake on this, and when the new county is formed, you're going to stay sheriff of one county, you're not going to become sheriff of the other county. Sounds good to me. And then when the time came, you know, Behan couldn't appoint someone else fast enough. So Wyatt was naive. He wasn't an unintelligent man. He was actually a smart man in a lot of ways, but politically, yes, quite naive. And he got stabbed in the back by Behan, which had to be a little bit of a factor in their growing confrontation and conflict.
One thing I didn't realize about him was his involvement with Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo itself kind of had a big role in the book too. So touch on the company's history and how that is tightly entwined with the American West.
Well, Wells Fargo came about as a shipping company, and the owners of Wells Fargo that banded together to form this company, they did something that was very smart. You had all across the West, you had a couple of things happening. One was you had these boom towns, and you know the ore, whether it was gold or silver, being extracted from these, usually in these mountains, had to be transported down to where they could be sold, and so banks needed cash, and people needed cash to buy this stuff, and then when they sold the gold, they needed banks and place. So who was going to deal with the transportation between the city or closest town or towns elsewhere? You also had a growing, United States mail delivery system. And yes, there was the Pony Express, but there was only so much mail that could be carried. Whereas if you had these wagons and stagecoaches crisscrossing the country, they could handle a lot of mail. So they were very much a part of the growth of the United States, and certainly in the communication system. Now, you could say, yes, once the telegraph became fully operational and available to many parts of the country, that cut down the need for mail hauling, but the need was not cut down for all kinds of shipping of goods and like I say, especially cash. That's why the story of Wells Fargo, and I think there's a writer, I think it's John Bosenecker, who's came out last year with a book about the history of Wells Fargo, which is very good. It talks about how the shipping of money, the shotgun messengers, they were called, who were riding on these many of them got killed or wounded severely, protecting these shipments of either gold or silver or cash or whatever getting through. It's pretty dramatic, and Wyatt Earp was off and on a shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo. So he had a couple of close calls while he was doing that. He didn't have a badge on. He was just getting a paycheck for protecting what was in the stagecoach.
And that's where the term riding shotgun comes from, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. Riding shotgun. If you hear that term, somebody gets in your car and says, "Okay, I'm riding shotgun." It came from people like Wyatt Earp, who were with their shotguns up on top of these wagons and stagecoaches to protect it.
And there's so many more tidbits to learn when we come back. Tom Clavin, we're going to continue the discussion about the truth about Tombstone. We'll be right back. The Mind's Eye is back with Tom Clavin. We're talking about his book, Tombstone, the Earp Brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell. And not too long before the shooting at OK Corral, there was actually an awkward get-together with many of the people from both parties with the Tombstone Raiders. I mean, and talk about the Tombstone Raiders and the rule of hospitality in that event and how they're all kind of mixed together there.
Well, that does make an extra layer of interest about the Tombstone story, because the Tombstone Raiders was like this ad hoc group that was formed. There was one time in I think it was June of '81, where Geronimo and a bunch of his warriors and some of their families, they broke out of the reservation they were being kept on, and were heading back to their homelands, which was in the mountains near Tombstone. And so the Tombstone Raiders was supposed to help protect Tombstone. So everybody, the call was put out. So you had, Wyatt Earp, you had Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, I think even Warren Earp, the youngest brother, was there. I think Doc Holliday, and you had the Clantons and McLaurys, and you had Curly Bill Process and Johnny Ringo. Everybody was sort of like, okay, let's put our differences aside because we've got this common enemy right now. And when they sort of encountered each other at somebody's ranch, right there you could have had the gunfight that became the gunfight at the OK Corral, but there's hospitality. If you're at somebody's ranch and you can't engage in any of your personal issues on somebody else's ranch, and that ranch owner has to extend hospitality. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you hate me or I hate you. You've come on my property on a peaceful mission, and I have to offer you coffee and breakfast or lunch or dinner, whatever the case may be. And sort of like connected to that is the night before the gunfight at the OK Corral, you had Sheriff Johnny Behan, Marshal Virgil Earp, and Ike Clanton, one of the Clanton brothers that was causing the biggest friction with the Earps. They played an all-night poker game together. So it's kind of like, okay, we might kill each other tomorrow, but I've got a good hand.
Yeah, there's just the whole rule of hospitality in the frontier, in the Wild West. It just seems so ridiculous and contradictory because, I mean, those same people that are given the hospitality, the next day they're stealing your cattle at the same time, right?
Right. or while you're getting the hospitality, they get one of their brothers stealing your cattle.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like that cast of characters over there. So what was Law and Order before the frontier like?
Well, you had on the East Coast and in the Midwest by that point, let's say after the Civil War, you had established police departments. You wouldn't have many towns or cities did not have a sheriff or a marshal. You had a commissioner of police. But as I said before, the frontier moved west faster than these bureaucracies could keep up. So that where you had an established law or a justice system too, where you had trials by juries and a jury pool and plenty of judges to go around and attorneys to go around. West of the Missouri, you didn't have that as much. So you could have somebody like a Judge Roy Bean, for example, or some of these the hanging judge, Parker, the hanging judge. They were the rulers of their courtrooms because they represented for better or worse, they represented the rudimentary, rough justice system that there was. So when you get to the extreme frontier, which in the 1870s and early 1880s Tombstone there was no other frontier past that. It was kind of like a spontaneous justice system. It really depended on the integrity and the sense of justice that certain individuals were there to uphold. And the cowboys didn't want a justice system because that could only be trouble for them. The ranchers who were stealing cattle in Mexico and secretly bringing it back across the border and rebranding them, they certainly didn't want any legal oversight. So it was really the community, the people that were building churches and schools and restaurants and hotels and wanted to raise families there. They were saying, we want law and order here, and if it's not going to catch up to us fast enough, but then we're going to basically delegate or appoint people that are going to protect us, whether they want to or not.
What I loved about your book and what we talked about before was that you did focus on all the aftermath of that event, which was really more interesting than the actual event in itself. But let's just stick just briefly with OK Corral, the actual gunfight, because it's funny how Doc Holliday is kind of, in movies he's portrayed as a hell of a gunslinger, right? In most of them at least. But to say the least, he was not. But he did come through at the actual time of the gunfight.
He did. I mean, Doc was not like he could talk a good game, and when push came to shove, like Ike Clanton when the gunfight began, he was bubbling with fear. But there's almost this amusing aspect to it because, like I say, Virgil had to hold his nose and appoint Doc Holliday as a temporary deputy. Doc was definitely not your law and order, representative, but he said, you can't do this to Wyatt. You can't do this without me. So Virgil said, all right, you're a deputy. And the other thing that happened is he handed Doc a shotgun because the Earp brothers knew that Doc could not hit the broadside of a bar with a pistol. He was not a good gunshot with a pistol. But it's hard not to hit something with a shotgun when you're in such close quarters like that. And when the shooting began, Doc stood his ground. And actually, except for Ike Clanton, everybody in that vacant lot stood their ground. They faced each other in a rather small vacant lot and fired at each other. There was no running around and hiding behind things. They fired at each other until the only one Wyatt Earp was the only one not wounded or not killed in that gunfight.
Yeah, it's truly astonishing how you cannot get wounded. I mean, let's focus a little bit on the aftermath, and so there was a trial that happened after the gunfight. Go into that.
Yeah, Ike Clanton, who's his brother Billy was killed. Both McLaury brothers, Tom and Frank, were killed in the gunfight. So Ike Clanton went to the courts and swore out, a accusation of murder. There was a charge lodged of murder against Wyatt, Doc, also Virgil and Morgan, but their wounds were too serious for them to actually come to the courthouse and stand trial. So Wyatt and Doc were put on trial for murder, and the trial, it's really a courtroom drama that took place over weeks. I mean, I think it was 30 days before a decision was rendered by the judge, and all kinds of people were coming in to give testimony. Now, you had some people who were giving anti-Earp testimony. They were there to say Earp instigated this, they're cold-blooded killers, they should be thrown in jail for their life, should be hung. And then you had eyewitnesses who said, well, we think the Earps were provoked, they had no choice. We saw one of the McLaury brothers, start to pull a pistol out of his belt, so they had no choice but to respond. So, and then you had Wyatt Earp himself giving testimony, and I quote from his testimony, which is very good to have his particular specific point of view. And they also hired this lawyer who was a rather flamboyant guy who was known as a silver-tongued orator to represent Doc and Wyatt. So it was a courtroom drama, and if it had ended differently, that the judge ruled that the Wyatt and Doc were not guilty of murder, or should not be standing even a bigger trial for murder. But if it had gone differently, it's interesting to speculate if they would have put the cuffs on Wyatt and Doc, took them off to Tucson, and they might end up in the state or federal prison for the rest of their lives.
And one of those amazing characters that did help them get off was Thomas Fitch, their defense attorney.
Right.
Tell us about his life, because it's pretty phenomenal, and his eventual influence on one of the great novelists of all time.
Yeah, Thomas Fitch was, again, a silver-tongued orator. He had all kinds of postings, and he actually worked also as a journalist for a time. But his biggest notoriety was as an attorney. And the Earps, I don't know how much Fitch got paid. I mean, did he do this because he wanted to represent the Earps? Because you'd think he was getting kind of expensive. He would be an expensive defense attorney. He was like the Perry Mason of his day, but he did manage to make enough good arguments and present witnesses that Earp and Doc got off. And then he continued. I think he was elected to office. At one point, he was a congressman from maybe Utah. I think he'd even known the judge at the trial, Wells Spicer, when they both were in Utah. I think he represented the Mormon Church for a time during a murder trial. So, and afterwards, years later, I think he was still when he was in his 70s, he returned to being a reporter. I think he was a reporter in Los Angeles, if I remember correctly. He spent years, right as a newspaper reporter. Very, very interesting life, and you love when you come across some of these characters. He's not going to be one of your main characters, but he's going to be a supporting character. But he's going to be a unique supporting character. There's something quite special about this character, and for a period of time, he made the difference really between Wyatt and Doc, being sent to prison for murder or going on there leading the rest of their lives.
And him and Mark Twain connected. How did they connect?
Oh, yeah. I think Twain and Fitch crossed paths, and Twain based a character on Fitch. And now my memory's a little cloudy now because I haven't read my own book in a few weeks. but he and Twain. That's one of the things I found remarkable in doing any of the books in the Frontier Mormon trilogy, Wild Bill, Dodge City, and Tombstone, is given the rudimentary transportation system of the time, how often characters cross paths. Wild Bill would cross paths with John Wesley Harding and the James brothers in his travels. There's a scene in Dodge City where Doc Holliday is playing cards with the James brothers and possibly Billy the Kid. We're not so sure about that. So, it's pretty remarkable that, given the fastest way they could get around were the trains, and they were not that fast, that characters would find them, famous characters would find themselves in the same place at the same time.
Now get back to the aftermath of the gunfight. So there was a trial, but then obviously there had to be a funeral for the people that the Earps killed, pretty much. And surprisingly, there was a large number of people who attended the funeral of the the supposed villains. Do you think that was morbid fascination or shows of sympathies with them?
Well, I think it was both. For some people, they attended. I mean, the McLowrys and Billy Clanton were put in these caskets, and they were in a wagon that was being pulled through town and up to where they would be buried, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people who were part of this funeral procession, and some of them were there for just morbid fascination. That was, the town shut down, so let's go be part of the funeral and see what's going on. But there were also people who were. It was a demonstration in a way. They wanted to show their support for the Cowboys. They wanted to. It was very much an anti-Earp exercise. They wanted the Earps arrested. They wanted the Earps to be convicted of murder. And so it was really a remarkable scene that was, upset John Clum, who was the pro-Earp editor of the Epitaph. It certainly disturbed the Earps because they had reluctantly taken on this role to protect the populace of Tombstone from the danger of the Cowboys and the corrupt ranchers, which they do, and they risk their lives. And Virgil and Morgan were both shot and almost lost their lives. Doc was shot too, but not as seriously. And then they turn around and they see half the town pour out in support of the other side. So it was very disturbing. They had to wonder, is there a bullseye on our backs?
Tell us about the Vendetta Ride and the events that led up to that.
Well, the Vendetta Ride was something that Wyatt never intended to do. I mean, Wyatt was not a vigilante. Wyatt was not a violent man. Like I said before, he was not somebody who was quick to reach for his gun and use it. And the ride came about because, the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was Wyatt and his brother Morgan, and they were very, very close brothers. And they were one night, actually the night before Wyatt's 34th birthday, they were shooting pool together at a local establishment. And from behind, a couple of shots rang out, and Morgan was shot in the back and died on the pool table. And people came running to see what was going on, and one of them who came running was Doc Holliday. And to me, it's a very important moment in that event where, as I describe in the book, where, Doc and Wyatt exchange a look. Like they know that something has to be done. They can't, who could be next? Is it going to be one of the Earp wives? Is it going to be another one of the Earp brothers? That they have to go out and end this thing by tracking down the bad guys, track down the evildoers, track down the guys that were part of this conspiracy to kill Earps. So Doc and Wyatt and Warren Earp, who's the youngest of the 5 Earp brothers who had been in Tombstone, and about 3 or 4 other fellows who were loyal to the Earp brothers, they saddle up and they basically formed this posse. There was some legal justification to it because Wyatt had been appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal. So there was that. It wasn't a completely vigilante operation. Nobody else was a lawman in this posse. And they went to track down the guys who had done the shooting or been part of this conspiracy. And they did shoot and kill several people during the Vendetta Ride, one of whom was Curly Bill Brocius. And Curly Bill was, along with Johnny Ringo, basically the 2 ringleaders of the psychopathic, brutal, murdering cowboy faction. And he'd just been itching for some time to have his confrontation, his showdown with Wyatt Earp. And it's a very dramatic moment when they do. Actually, Curly Bill and his henchmen were waiting, and Wyatt rode right into an ambush. And all of a sudden, bullets are flying, and Wyatt Earp is totally exposed. Again, he escapes being shot. But in the confrontation, he kills Curly Bill Brocius. So that was, that was not the first one who was killed on Vendetta Ride. It eventually ended not because everybody that Wyatt was looking for got apprehended or killed. It was that the Vendetta Ride was so successful that everybody else scattered. They probably never would have found some of these other guys. And they also had a posse on their trail. So a decision was made that they were going to, they would either have to come back to Tombstone and surrender themselves or leave Arizona. They chose to leave Arizona because they did not have enough faith in the justice system back in Tombstone.
Let's do just a quick epilogue for some of the major players involved. Doc and Wyatt, they got into a disagreement after the Vendetta Ride, which I don't think they talked for about 3 years or so. What was that dispute over?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for it, because neither one of them really ever talked about it. But there have been people maybe that they talked to, or people who thought they knew what it was about. It seems to be that the Wyatt, after the Vendetta Ride, he was planning to head to San Francisco and reunite with Josephine Marcus, who would become the fourth Mrs. Earp. And she was Jewish, and Doc was upset that Wyatt was in love with a Jewish woman. And so words were exchanged. Wyatt would not tolerate Doc's anti-Semitism. And so they had this falling out. And I don't know, it was a couple of years, whatever it was, they did not see each other, which had to be a tragedy for both of them, because they were, especially for Doc, Wyatt was his only friend. And but eventually, Wyatt got word that Doc was seriously ill, and they did have this rapprochement, this reunion, so that when Doc died, it was, he and Wyatt had repaired their relationship. Doc was only, I think, 36, 37 when he died of the lung disease that he had been battling since he was a young man. Virgil Earp, and his wife Allie spent like 40 years together. Virgil always had a kind of semi-useless left arm, but otherwise a pretty good life. He was very happy with his marriage, and he discovered he had a daughter he never knew about, and had a relationship with her in his later years. Wyatt he and Josephine were together for 43 years. I mean, it took him 4 wives. The fourth try finally got marriage right. And they were together for like 43 years. A lot of them wandering, ironically, like his father had done. He was even a saloon keeper in Alaska. He was in businesses in Colorado. He sold real estate in San Diego for a few years. And his last years, he and Josephine were spent in Los Angeles, and he made some extra money being an advisor on the silent cowboy movies, and especially for a young emerging director named John Ford. Wyatt lived to a pretty ripe old age for that time period in American history. He died. He was 2 months before his 81st birthday.
Yeah, there's a lot of irony in all of that. Becoming a kind of a cowboy whisperer for the movies of a sort. And now he didn't have any children, right? I mean, obviously the one that died young or was stillborn. He didn't have any after that, though, right?
With his other wives, he did not have any children. It's which is kind of a shame for if you want to write about the Earp family, or especially about Wyatt, because you don't have that that direct descendant. Wyatt did not have a son or a daughter, who in turn had a son or a daughter, who in turn had a son or a daughter, and some of that family lore and anecdotes being passed down from one generation to the next. Morgan did not have any children. Warren did not have any children. James Earp, his wife Bessie, who also were in Tombstone at that time, he had adopted Bessie's children when he married her. It's kind of interesting how unfertile the Earp that branch of the Earp family was. Meanwhile, the Earps, their father Nicholas Earp, with 2 wives, he had 10 kids.
Do you have any social media or how can people get the books? Anything that you want to connect them with?
Well, anybody's welcome to go to my website, tomclavin.com, TOMCLAVIN, tomclavin.com. Obviously, there's Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I'm a big supporter of independent bookstores, so if one in your community is open, please stop in and say, I'm looking for a copy of Tombstone or Dodge City or Wild Bill.
Two Guns, Tom Clavin, setting the record straight about the famous gunfight at OK Corral. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, partner.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back with the Mind's Eye Wrap-Up. Time for the Mind's Eye Wrap-Up. Bang-up job by author Tom Clavin, rounding out his Lawman trilogy. And we kind of have our own version of Lawman trilogy going on here. Our first was from a few weeks back when we talked to a couple police officers about some hot-button topics, stories from the beat. We got this little ditty of an episode, and then next week, rounding it out, we're speaking with the great-great-grandchildren of notorious outlaw Jesse James Daniel and Teresa Duke, they will present 20 years of research into state and federal records, photographs, newspaper reports, diaries, and DNA tests that confirm Jesse James faked his own death and lived out his remaining days in Texas. Join us next week when we look into the mysterious life and fake death of Jesse James. Until then, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for The Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye Show with Brian Turnoff is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and all major platforms. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing.